Well, it's good to see everybody. Um, this is actually the second in a sort of short series of talks loosely connected to the exhibition here, Made of Earth, which many of you have already seen, I think. And in the first of these talks, those of you who were here, we actually were talking about what we call the ritual dimension of the exhibition. And mentioning one of the key technological innovations in ceramic design, which influenced the whole process. And that was, of course, the invention of the fast revolving wheel, which in fact goes back into the third millennium BC at least, because we know the Egyptians were familiar with it themselves. Now today, we're going to be talking about another major event, I suppose, not this time an invention as such, but the discovery in China about 1,000 years ago or more of a substance called kaolin, China clay. And that, of course, made possible the process of creation of porcelain. And that's really what this talk is about. Because I think that porcelain really has produced some of the most brilliant decorative ceramics of all time. And it's also proved absolutely fascinating, obsessively so perhaps, to European artists through the generations. So we begin, as I said, in China, and at a particular place. And this is the city of Jingdezhen in Jiangxi province in China, and in the hills or mountains of Jingdezhen, the kaolin has been mined for centuries. And so really, Jingdezhen was, and still is, really a city entirely devoted to the manufacture of porcelain. There are innumerable kilns, as there always were, and it is in fact a major tourist attraction. The manufacture of porcelain has been known about for over 1,000 years, but porcelain has been known about in the West for about 800 years. Now, I say known about because, of course, the actual technique of the manufacture of porcelain wasn't actually discovered in the West until much later than it was in China. The first recorded mention of porcelain in the West comes from the journals of that extraordinary explorer, Marco Polo. I think he's a lovely writer because he went eastwards to the court of the great Khan, that is Kublai Khan of the poem. And one of the things about Marco Polo is everything he sees is a wonder, is marvelous, is superb, and he's full of this kind of admiration and enthusiasm. So this is what he says about porcelain. And this is writing in 1291. As I say, the first recorded reference in the West. And he reaches a city called Tinju. And here, as he says, they make bowls of porcelain, large and small, of incomparable beauty. They are made nowhere else except in this city. And from here they are exported all over the world. In the city itself, they are so plentiful and cheap that for a Venetian groat, you might buy 3 bowls of such beauty that nothing lovelier can be imagined. These dishes are made of crumbly earth or clay which is dug as though from a mine and stacked in huge mounds, and then left for 30 or 40 years exposed to wind, rain, and sun. By this time, the earth is so refined that dishes made of it are of an azure tint with a very brilliant sheen. You must understand that when man makes a mound of this earth, he does so for his children. The time of maturing is so long that he cannot hope to draw any profit from it himself, or to put it to use, but the son who succeeds him will repay the fruit. That's a lovely description. And he makes a number of points. And that is that objects in porcelain are of a supreme beauty. Nothing else quite matches these objects. It's a very, very slow process, matured for 30 or 40 years. And it goes through generations. I'm sure that the families in Junior Zen today, whose junior descendants were making porcelain for that length of time. Now, I'm not an expert, because I'm not a potter, but I gather that the process of porcelain manufacture is extremely dicey. It's a difficult medium to work, and there are around the city of Dijon, now as there were in the past, mountains of discarded bits and bobs of porcelain objects as a fail. So it needs to be handled with care. My understanding is that it needs kilns which are heated to a very high temperature. I think somebody mentioned about 1300 degrees Celsius or thereabouts. It's very, very high temperature. And in our exhibition downstairs, we have, as you come into the exhibition through the gallery where they're making clay, we have a facsimile of a fire, of flames. And that's actually quite important because it's very important that the object itself, the porcelain, is not exposed directly to that intense heat. So around it, they put a clay shell, as it were, to protect it, and that is called a saga. A saga. Now, a brief digression. You might say you can't start to talk with a digression. But I can't resist this. In the old days of the black and white televisions, you remember black and white televisions where you had a dicey picture and you actually the cure was to bash the set and hope it would work. You know? There was a panel game called What's My Line, and the chap who the master seller was Zane Andrews, some of you may remember. And it was a rather silly program because they had to guess. They had to guess people's occupations, right? And the panel were blindfolded because somebody would do a line, and the viewers would know what the occupation was. And they had to guess on the mind what this person did. And this guy was the contestant. He came from Stoke-on-Trent. Now, Stoke-on-Trent, as many of you know, is the big battery manufacturers in the United Kingdom. And this mine was completely indecipherable. Nobody would have guessed it. And it turned out that his occupation was a cider maker's bottom. I think it's absolutely wrong. Try putting that on your CV. A cider maker's bottom. And what he was responsible for, of course, was knocking the bottom out of the cider. So that it was, the cider maker's bottom. Probably generations of bottom so this is part of the manufacture of the porcelain. Now, I'm going to show these two examples of the Junior Zen porcelain. Not because they're in the exhibition, which they're not, but because they are very, very important in the context of Chinese ceramics. So much so that they really could be called iconic. And these are the so-called David vases, because they're in the collection of the Merciful David at the Oriental Museum in London. And the reason why they're so important and so iconic, basically, is because, first of all, they are extremely impressive. This slide doesn't give you any idea about the size of these things. They're 1 and 2 feet high, 2 feet off the ground. They're not identical, even though they might appear to be. But they are probably one of the few surviving pairs extant of what has now become known as the blue and white style of Chinese ceramics, which is the most typical style. Now, we say extant because scholars, I think, agree that these don't represent the first blue and white ceramic vases. These have been produced probably quite a bit before that, but these are some of the early few that we actually know about. They're not the most elegant to my mind, but they are mighty impressive. And they're made, as I say, using the China clay, but the China clay on its own isn't the main ingredient of porcelain. There is also, now Margaret will correct me, I'm sure, on the pronunciation here, what they call petunse, which is petunse, P-E-T-U-N-S-E, which is China stone. And the mixture is what makes the porcelain, because the Chinese say that it's like flesh and bones to be able to kind of walk down the other. But these are I think, the most magnificent productions. And therefore they are some of the oldest. And they're an example of the blue and white style. Now the blue is what they call cobalt blue. It's actually, cobalt is a mineral which was, I think, known to the Mongols quite an early period. And it comes into China via, it's mined, I think, in Persia. It comes into China out of the Persian Gulf and eventually reaches China. The thing about cobalt is, I think it still is, as it was then, ludicrously expensive. It's a little bit like lapis lazuli, with that particular, I think it's terribly expensive. It's difficult in the sense that it comes either in the form of an oxide, or it can be pounded in water to produce a fine material which is then mixed and applied to the pot like a paint, but it is terribly toxic. And I think some of these painters, some of the artists, if you actually imagine yourself painting a picture, you're likely sometimes to lick the brush to get a fine point. Do that too many times with cobalt and you're in trouble. Okay, so that's how it's actually produced. But one of the things that you may notice on these vases, and it is to my mind, my understanding, a characteristic of Chinese porcelain, is the extent of the decoration. These are highly decorated vases, so the most elaborate that you'll find. The handles are in the shape of elephants, and just what you have here, the extent of the decoration. On the rim, the shoulder, and the upper foot, you have chrysanthemums, lotus flowers, and peonies. On the lower neck are phoenixes. But I think my favourite of these is the dragons riding around the whole pot. And the dragons in Chinese mythology, they're not the snow type dragons, the opera dragon in Tolkien. They're symbols of good fortune, prosperity, longevity. They are positive features of Chinese design. So there we are. There's some most beautiful extant, the earliest extant examples of blue and white. Now, in our, this is actually mixing the cobalt blue. This is actually England, not China, but nevertheless, which is some idea of what's going on there. Okay? This is our role, and it's in the exhibition downstairs, and I think it's an absolute beauty. And this actually, really is a marvelous example of a typical type of Chinese porcelain, blue and white ware, which was widely exported to Europe. Now, in the early days, the time of the David Francis, 14th century, this blue and white ware was exported, but it was actually exported mainly to the Middle East, not to Europe. And the potters of places like Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, they imitated the blue and white, but they didn't have access, of course, to cave, to Chinese stone. So what they were working with was earthenware. But if you look at some of the productions of the Ottoman potters, they're absolutely fabulous. And what they've done is use the blue and white and incorporated Islamic motifs and designs to stunning effect. They really are absolutely magnificent. But a bowl like this is exported in large quantities to, they were exported in large quantities to Europe in the Ming period, the Chinese dynasty, in the time of the Emperor Wan Li. His dates are 1573 to 1619. Now again, this bowl shows features which are added to satisfy European tastes. So all the gold around the rim and the handles in the shape of caryatids, these are to satisfy European fashions, but the gold around the rim has a practical purpose too, because it means that the object is not actually chipped easily, so it does have a use there. But basically, again, you can see that the object is very highly decorated. And in this particular case, you can, I think you can clearly see horses are featured very prominently. And again, these are animals revered in China from the time of the Han Dynasty, which is about 206 to 220 BCE. And that veneration of the horse comes again from the Mongols, because you know as well as I do that in Mongolia, horses are really extremely important for many different reasons. And in this particular case, swift horses, and this lot do look pretty swift, they're moving about rather quickly. Swift horses were thought to possess supernatural powers and to assist souls on the way to paradise. So again, very, very important there. Also, you have landscapes featured, and that actually relates to the development of landscape painting in China during the Song Dynasty, about 960 to 1279. The landscape painting was considered to be superior to all other art forms, and landscape painting in China, I don't know whether you know Chinese style landscape painting, but it was absolutely fantastic and beautiful examples of landscape. And the landscapes are always the same. They combine realistic observation with a kind of sense of the mystical nature of landscape. There's this idea that there's something that underlies the landscape, which is a kind of spiritual essence that the Chinese call the Tao. That's T-A-O. And in this particular case, You've got the usual kind of landscapes where there is more people, with a great sense of tranquility in the sea. Also interestingly, now I haven't seen this because I haven't looked inside this part, but I gather from the description of the Essential Guide, there's also something called a cacra, a flaming cacra. And a cacra is a Buddhist symbol. And Buddhism came into China well before well before the 16th century, in the form of, well, it mixed with Confucianism and Taoism to produce a distinctively Chinese version of Buddhism, which is illustrated here. The Kakra is about the wheel of life, the wheel of rebirth. So you've got the Buddhist influence coming through there. Okay? Now, I think this is an absolute sweetie. This is, again, a product of the Ming Dynasty, but quite different in style from the object that we've just been looking at. And therefore, we're very, very individual. Now, the interesting thing here is that this object, which is a sweetmeat dish, can be used in the tea ceremony in Japan, because this object is produced in China, but for export to Japan. So it combines in itself the Chinese styles of porcelain manufacture, but also taking into account the need to appeal to Japanese tastes. So you've got two things combined. Now, one thing that's always struck me about this rightly or wrongly is that the design on the, as you can see it on the left-hand side, reminds me very much of calligraphy. And calligraphy has got that free-flowing line about it. Calligraphy was always recognized as superior to all other styles of painting. Superior in the eyes of the Chinese Ming men of culture. I like that. Men of culture. The name, I think, is Wen Ren. So if you're one of the Wen Rens, you're doing all right. Okay? And of course, it's actually, the style also incorporates, if you look closely at it, it incorporates another odd feature, because in the glaze, there are little blobs and flecks, they almost look like a sprinkle across it. And the edges, and you can see it a bit better here, I think, the edges are slightly uneven. It's not a particularly, as you would say, refined piece. And that, I think, if I'm right, is intentional. Because to my mind, this actually equates to the Japanese style, which is a kind of a controlled imperfection. The Japanese call it McBurnie, a controlled imperfection. And I think if I'm correct, I seem to remember somewhere that in Japan, if a dish or whatever is cracked, they fill in the cracks in gold so that it is incorporated into the beauty of the design. And the idea is that the viewer shares in the process of creation, and the effect should appear, as one critic has put it, as deliberate as the decoration of a Dresden plate. In other words, it's not a fault, it's not a kind of a defect, it's part of the creative process. I like that. I like that idea. I have a quotation here from which I think is very interesting, from the eminent Victorian architect John Ruskin. And Ruskin is writing critically about the idea of perfection which has dominated Western art, Western European art. And he says, the demand for perfection is always a sign of a misunderstanding of the ends of art. Imperfection is in some sort essential to all we know of life. It is the sign of life in a mortal body. To banish imperfection is to paralyze vitality. And I think that's a very interesting observation. Because I don't know about you, but the older I get, the more I'm so kind of a little bit put off by the great, perfect, wonderful works of art. Masterpieces worry me. And I'm much more drawn than I used to be to the small scale, the challenge, and so on. Now, it's a personal view, I totally disagree. But I think Ruskin has a point in what he's saying about the imperfection. But the most fascinating thing about this, I think, is that it's a hair. It's in the shape of a hair. And the hair is an extremely important symbol in Chinese thought. And in Taoist mythology, hairs symbolize the all-important idea of longevity and immortality. Because as the essential guide will tell you, hares live on the moon and spend their time brewing the elixir of immortality. They brew the elixir, they get it going, and the whole process is supervised by a giant toad, which is good, of course, because that's what giant toads spend their time doing, to supervise this kind of thing. And so the preoccupation with not only immortality and longevity, but also the discovery of the elixir that will go beyond longevity to the attainment of immortality. And one sage, Chinese sage, writes, with guidance on the use of herbs, you may achieve longevity, but still you will have to die. Only imbibe the holy elixir, and your present body will become immortal, lasting as long as heaven and earth. You will climb among clouds, ride upon a dragon up and down through the azure canopy. Sounds good. That's okay with me. Now, the whole idea is to achieve the condition of the immortals. And these figures are important in Chinese mythology because these are human beings who have achieved this state of immortality. And they have complete freedom. They're completely free of all the restraints and constraints of ordinary human beings. My reflection is that one aspect of Chinese thinking is that the immortals live on an island just off the coast of China. And you can actually, on a clear day, you can see it through telescopes and so on, and observe the immortals having a damn good time. And you think, I'd like to do that. I think it's a similar idea, isn't it, in Irish mythology, the idea of High Brazen, the island off the coast of the rest of it. I seem to remember that certain Chinese emperors actually sent out fleets to try to make contact with the immortals of this island. That's the idea. So the elixir brewed up over a furnace, high heat, and the ingredients sound interesting. The ingredients for the elixir, you just you're jotting this down and taking notes and so on, but don't try this at home. The ingredients include cinnabar, gold, silver, a plant called qi, which is something to do with sesame seeds, jade, and pearls. Put them all together, high heat, 370 degrees, and it's bubbling away. It has to be refined 9 times before it's quite ready to be imbibed. Now, a problem might occur to some of you here, that if you're after immortality, it's not a good idea to combine together substances which are poisonous. It might be slightly counterproductive. And indeed it was, but it didn't deter those who had the money and the prestige to want to obtain this from trying it. And many died. So, but you can see how important it is and why it actually is found in our piece. I think it's an absolute gem, one of my favourites in the collection. Okay. Now, turning to Japan, and the situation with Japanese ceramics is slightly different, but it is connected with everything that we've been saying so far. Japanese ceramics were exported in enormous quantities to Europe between the second half of the 17th century and the first half of the 18th century. The kilns in Japan were set up at a place called Arita after kaolin was discovered and mined in 1616. And this, in fact, is a photograph of one of the kilns at Arita. So this is the equivalent of Jingazen in the Japanese context. Japanese ceramics were exported via the port of Imari, and that's what it's called Imari ware, even though it's not made there, it's not manufactured there, to Europe. The trade was controlled by the Dutch East India Company, and they began export from Japan in 1656. Now, this is quite late in comparison with the Chinese experience. And the reason why they began this trade at that time was that conditions were extremely favourable. The reason why there was this late start was that in the centuries preceding the 16th century, Japan seems to have been more or less in a permanent state of chaos. The society was very unstable. There were constant battles between competing warlords who were battling for power. And that, as I say, produced a very unstable society. But in 1603, Japan was brought under the control of the shoguns, who were effectively the military governors of Japan, the shoguns of the Tokugawa family. And they sounded to be a pretty ruthless lot. And they more or less established a military dictatorship over Japan. But what it did was it produced a period, the beginning of a period of comparative stability. And this in Japanese culture is known as the Edo period. They transferred their capital to Edo from the old imperial capital of Kyoto. And Edo, of course, as you probably know, is the name for Tokyo. That is what we now know as Tokyo. And that period, that Edo period, proved quite suitable for the production of art. And basically, that period lasted from about 1603 all the way through to 1868. A very, very long period. The emperor was still there, but only had a symbolic role. But in 1868, the shoguns were overthrown, the emperor was restored, and Japan began to industrialize and modernize. And that's when Japan really starts to open up to the West. So you have the beginnings of industry in Japan, a modern army, a modern navy, and a huge period of contact. And you probably know that everything Japanese at that time became extremely fashionable, including, for instance, Japanese prints, woodblock prints. In Japan, you could have bought them for the price of a bowl of rice. In Europe, they became much sought after and prized by collectors, and many French artists were influenced by Japanese prints. That period produces a very, very good flower of art. And the other thing which worked to Japanese advantage was that in 1644, the Ming dynasty collapsed, and there was a huge period of chaos again, and the gills at Jin were destroyed. They were set on fire because the Ming dynasty, which took the place of the Qing dynasty, so they're getting their Mings and Qings mixed up. The Qing dynasty replaced the Ming dynasty, but there was a period of great instability. And in 1656, the Qing rulers shut down production altogether. It just stopped. And that period of cessation lasted until 1684. Now, that meant there was a gap in the market. And the Dutch East India Company were quick enough to take advantage of that and to start up the trade in Japanese ceramics to the West. Okay? So that then became extremely fashionable. When production resumed in China, of course, Chinese ware began to flow into the West again, and that meant that Japanese ware, which was expensive, became less fashionable in the West and therefore fashionable at the time. So by the middle of the 18th century, Japanese ceramics are much less sought after in the West than they were in the earlier period. Now, what does Japanese ceramics look like, and what's the difference? Well, again, what an absolute cracker this is. It's in the camera behind you. So you have a picture, and you have the original in the camera. And it really is absolutely unreal. Now, what's the difference? Well, there is a considerable difference, really, because one of the things you may have noticed in relation to what we've said about Chinese ceramics is that Japanese ceramics are the Imari type. And I think this is actually, I'm just trying to remember, I think this is what they call Kokainu Imari. This is much less highly decorated than the Chinese examples. There's a lot of unglazed surface, which to my mind makes it more appealing in many ways. The colours, again, you see that you've got the joint on the natural world. The colours are a little bit more muted. I love this kind of, I don't know what you call it, I think they call it an iron red in design. It's very, very delicate and very beautifully done. And you'll notice the use of gold, which is again is a characteristic of Japanese ceramics. I don't know what these would be used for. I don't know what we call it. Is a pot or a jug? But the hand was a very small one, so it doesn't look as if things have been poured out of it. But it's just so elegant and so beautifully balanced, and that little line, little Buddhist mythological creature, which shows that Buddhist influence. Okay. All right. Now, basically, I think that's more or less what I've got to say about Japanese ceramics. But of course, the Dutch East India Company were quite shrewd in the way they managed the trade in Japanese ceramics. They suspended production and then released more. and they suspended at least more, just to keep the price up. And of course, it made a great appeal to European collectors. None more so than the guy on the left, who is Augustus the Strong, looking appropriately strong. In fact, appropriately unpleasant, which in fact, by all accounts, he was. Augustus the Strong was the Elector of Saxony and an avid collector of all things Oriental, Chinese, Japanese, Indonesian. Now, we had two principal advantages. One, unlimited supplies of money, and two, an unlimited supply of ego, which basically meant what he wanted, he got. And what he wanted was supply of Chinese porcelain and Japanese porcelain in limitless numbers. Now, admittedly, what appealed to Augustus was what appealed to many European collectors: the sheer beauty of porcelain. He was more or less obsessed by it. But the Europeans didn't know how to manufacture. And so he was constantly on the hunt for the way of producing porcelain. And this was a guy, Wilhelm Friedrich Böttcher, who found it first. Now, the more you read about this guy, the more the whole process sounds a complete and utter accident. Because this guy, Böttcher, was employed as an employee. He wasn't really employed. Augustus kidnapped him and imprisoned him in the next slide. Well, this is Dresden. Augustus is city, a beautiful city, Lunchtime is, but this is where Böttcher was imprisoned for, I think it was about 13 years or something. Not trying to find porcelain, but he was employed as an alchemist to discover the secret of turning base metal into gold. But in the process of that, by accident, he found the secret of manufacturing porcelain. And that was it, basically. Because Augustus then, led the Masons factory. But as I say, there are lots and lots of stories around how this happened. And somebody met someone who found the secret by observing what his wig maker put on his wig. Some peculiar connection between that and that. But however it happened by one of those happy accidents. And from then on, of course, it just goes just true. And after Meissen, you get all sorts of discoveries of China clay. And in Cornwall, there's a guy called Cookworthy, who was a Quaker chemist in Plymouth, who accidentally came on the secret of manufacturing it by observing the Cornish mine workers using this mysterious white clay to repair bits of their mining equipment. And now, of course, if you go to Cornwall, the areas around St. Austin are full of clay pits. It looks pretty heavy. And then, of course, the big guys are involved. The guys with the clout, the power, and their name was regimented. And that took up in England. So it was all over the business. Okay. Now we have two most beautiful objects in the cabinet behind you that shows the extent of the Japanese influence on Meissen porcelain. You couldn't have a clearer indication of just how influential the Japanese model is. You've got everything there. You notice the areas of undecorated porcelain, very limited decoration, very beautifully and sparingly used. Okay? And lastly, an absolutely beautiful snuff box, which is in the cabinet behind you, which just shows two things. One, that with his money, power, and influence, Augustus could employ the best. And it doesn't get much better than this in terms of, you see the size of it, the miniaturization of it, and the delicacy and intricacy of the decorations is wonderful. This is made using a kiln at a quite a low temperature to manufacture ceramics and so on. But lovely designs. You've got the Arcadian scene here. This is very rococo stuff. And if I'm not mistaken, the palace behind you is Albecksberg Castle. Nice. So it's an interesting story now. One of those nice narratives as well as producing some absolutely